Welcome to video 4. Today we're going to talk about how documents such as the Mayflower Compact and other important concepts have influenced the American government. So let's get to it. First of all, we want to talk about the power of early government. So when we're talking about governments, these early governments, we're talking about specifically those governments in Great Britain, okay? Because that's kind of the example upon which, we had to work with as colonists. So first of all, we have these two concepts of limited government and representative government. Now I'm going to give you these definitions and then we're going to jump back and talk about them. So starting here with limited government, this is probably the easiest definition you will ever have in your entire life. Limited government is a government that is limited and not absolute. Okay, this means that there are certain things that the government can do and then there are certain things that the government can't do. Now, most of the time, what are these governments limited by? A constitution. Okay, how is our government limited? Our government is limited by a constitution which sets out specific things that it can do and specific things that it can't do. Okay, so limited government was something that we really needed to emphasize in the colonies because the government in Great Britain was really not limited, specifically dealing with the colonial economy. Then we also wanted representative government. Now, representation in the legislative branch was one of the big reasons that the American colonists decided to rebel from Great Britain because, we were really mad that we had taxation, anybody representing us in Parliament in Great Britain. So we wanted to make sure that our new government was going to be limited in power and also formed on a representative basis. Okay? So some important documents that we want to talk about, and I very rarely have you guys remember any dates, but one of the dates that I want you to remember for all of time is when the Magna Carta was signed, okay? The Magna Carta was signed in 1215, and it was signed by this guy named King John, okay? Now, King John of England, if you've ever seen the cartoon Robin Hood, the Disney cartoon, Prince John in that movie is depicted as this cowardly lion, snivelly, sneaky, thieving guy. He's supposed to represent King John, okay? Now, King John was notorious for attempting to seize power, increasing taxes for his own benefit. So Disney does a pretty good job of depicting Prince John in that movie. Anyway, the Magna Carta is extremely important because this was the first document that was signed to limit the power of a monarch, okay? At this time in Europe, we're still functioning under absolute monarchs. So monarchs aren't used to having to answer to someone or having their power limited. So the Magna Carta, first document to limit the power of a king. Now, you may ask, why would King John sign this if it's going to limit his power? Well, he was forced to. It was like literally forced to at sword point. So, of course, he signed it, to save his own life. Next, we have the Petition of Right. And this was signed in 1628 by King Charles I. Now, King Charles meets kind of a grisly fate later on in that he was beheaded. But the Petition of Right was signed to essentially prevent the king from acting without the consent of Parliament. Now, remember, Parliament is the legislative body in Great Britain. So we have Congress in America. The comparable body in England is Parliament. So he couldn't do things like raise taxes without Parliament's consent. He couldn't order martial law in a time of peace unless he had Parliament's consent. Just those type of things that were geared towards limiting his power. Moving on then to the English Bill of Rights. This was signed in 1688, and it was signed by William and Mary of Orange. And no, this is not like Orange County. This is a place at that time. Anyway, so again, the English Bill of Rights was, the main goal of it was to limit the power of the monarch and to preserve the rights of the people. So some specific things that are very familiar to us as we look at the English Bill of Rights. We have the freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, protection against excessive fines. Those are two examples from the English Bill of Rights that directly go with our United States Bill of Rights. So of course, we see some similarities between those two. We also want to look at some early constitutions. So in the early 1620s, when the Pilgrims were on the Mayflower and they were coming to the New World, one of the big things that they did was that they drafted the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact was signed on board the Mayflower, as you can maybe guess, because it's called the Mayflower Compact. And it formed the first system of representative government in the United States, okay, or self-government in what would become the United States. So basically, you've got all these families, they're on the Mayflower. They realize that when they get to the New World, they're probably not going to have an established government there waiting for them. Maybe they don't have the right to the land that they're going to land on. So we needed to find some sort of binding document that would protect people in this new world. So the Mayflower Compact was signed, and it was signed by representatives from the families on board the Mayflower. So that's why it's called a representative system, and it's also the first system of self-government. Then we have the general fundamentals and the fundamental orders of Connecticut. Both of these are going to, it basically sets up governments in specific areas, okay? So the general fundamentals dealing specifically with power, how power is going to be divided, dealing with representation, and then the fundamental orders of Connecticut, obviously dealing with the same thing, but focusing on Connecticut. The fundamental orders of Connecticut called for separation of powers, which was kind of a big deal, and it helped give some guidance and lay some foundation for our Constitution. And that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, let me know.